Welcome back, stranger. You're here for another story? Then let me tell you about how a noble knight sees his pursuit for a better empire and revenge for his people in a way that can warp reality itself. This is the story of the Red Knight. In the vast realm of Akshi, there exists a kingdom of people that call themselves the Beholden Demesne. They had begun a period of conquest and unification. The only people that were left to bend to their unbeholden king were the barbarians people known as the Atrogai. But now it was time for them to fall and their people to stop existing in the land, for they were savages and were not made for the civilized world. The army of the unbeholden king was ready to move, but one of his mightiest warriors in his right hand decided that he could take a group of men and end this with minimal casualties. His name was Saraglek. He took a group of his noble men and were ready to attack, but before the attack, Saraglek made sure his men understood one thing, as he said, "Remember, we are justice. This is no sack. If the enemy surrenders, grant him quarter. If he does not, well..." This raised up the spirits of his men, and they raised their swords and axes, and they began their stealth attack. They decided to attack by climbing one of the simple made walls, and as the red mist accompanied them, they were hitting from the Atrogai guardsmen. As Saraglek made quick work of the wall, he ended up in between two of the guardsmen. In the mind of Saraglek, the sight of a noble giant knight sporting red armor must have been a true surprise, but that was not the reaction that the guardsmen had. They had a look of utter terror, and instead of fighting, they began to flee. The great knight felt bad for these last remnants of the Atrogai, and now the bloodlust of battle had taken over and the rest of the warriors began to kill the Atrogai. There was no need to sound the alarm, for the sound of screams and falling corpses was good enough. The place had now become a hunting ground for Saraglek's forces, and these were the last of the Atrogai, for there would be no reinforcements. The unbeholden king had made sure by eliminating any other savage barbarians that could come for their aid, and truly was their last bastion. But this was well protected from a full-scale assault. Even if they had makeshift houses made from the rusted sheets of metal, but a 3 multi-barreled cannon, undoubtedly stolen from more civilized lands, loomed atop of an improvised turret on the walls. But they were too scared and panicked to reach them. The confusion of their sudden attack was throwing them off guard. At least, this is what Saraglek thought, for this was his point of view. Battle had now turned into a full-on massacre by the great noble knights. The barbarians were being mangled and their bodies horribly destroyed. The sound of bones breaking was echoing around the settlement, arms and legs being shattered as if it was nothing, sending crimson sprays all over the place. Off the distance, Saraglek saw the shine of red armored forms of his comrades, and suddenly he came to his senses. He shook his head in disgust. The slaughter had been excessive, too excessive. Given his brutality, it was only natural that the Atrogai were so terrified of him. To them, he was no bringer of justice, no knight. To them, he was a monster and a butcher. This is where he stopped his men and let the enemy regroup, for they were civilized, and they would offer these barbarians the right to surrender with their lives. And he spoke to them saying, "I am Saraglek. I am the Duke of Amorkai, Marshal of the Beholden Demesne, and the right hand of the unbeholden king. You have despoiled our realm and savaged our people, and now I am your judgment. I am not without mercy, and the unbeholden king is a generous ruler. You have impressed him, and we will allow you to join his victory feast, providing you kneel." But despite his offer, the Atrogai launched their attack and the battle ensued. The lust of battle had returned, and despite being wounded and feeling the pain as the weapons of the Atrogai managed to break through his breastplate, Saraglac never felt more alive. Somewhere in the corner of his mind, restraint and disgust is being drowned by the tide of blood. And eventually, most of the Atrogai had fled or were wounded. But the knights still kept hacking at their mauled bodies, and Saraglac stopped them and rallied to them. To him, they were not animals or orcs. They were civilized, brave knights. They reached the great hall of the settlement, which was adorned with what he considered stolen goods from his realm. And in the middle of the table that clearly separated the people into classes to him, this was not the sign of a true civilized people. For his king was honest and fair, and the king, knights, and the commoners all dined together under the unbeholden king. As they moved into the halls, they saw the supposed king of the Atrogai and a group of warriors that looked like knights. Saraglac offered them once more to surrender, but the warriors ignored him and shouted something he had heard before. Something that sounded familiar to him. They said, "Hold the line, trust in Sigmar." And this triggered something inside Saraglac. He turned around and he saw in the mirrors hanging in the walls, and he saw his reflection, and he saw the reflection of his men. But he did not see noble warriors. What he saw was hunched degenerates loping about behind him, their flesh threaded by bones, their tangled hair matted with gore and entrails, and their weapons were clubs fashioned from sharpened bones. Then he looked at himself, and what he saw was horrifying. A pale-fleshed and hideously scarred, wrecked by deformity and caked in gore from head to toe. A savage club fashioned from the bones of some gigantic monster replaced his ruined mace. Into his mind he was speaking. He could understand himself saying, "What is this?" But what came out of his mouth was no words. It was more of a revolting and abhorrent screech. And when he looked at the warriors, they were not savages. They were clad in shiny armor with feather-crested helms and shields and blazed with celestial heraldry. And behind them, elderly folk, women, and children. Then he saw some of his men tearing into the flesh of their enemies, sinking their fangs into their flesh. That is when two of the monsters looked at him with confusion. Saraglac could not understand what was happening. He clawed into his chest where his breastplate should be, and he felt the gash burn. But it was not true. He blamed the sudden horribly sight of himself and his men to the mirrors, that somehow the Atrogai had casted a spell and bewitched him to see this illusion. So he destroyed the mirrors, and everything was back to how it should have been. His men returned to the noble knights clad in red armor. It was all a lie. It all must have been a lie to him. This angered him, and he was gonna show no more mercy. And at this point, he did not care if the Atrogai saw him as a monster. He had to end them all. He let his men massacre the last remnants of the Atrogai, and as he walked away, he could still feel the burn of the gash he caused himself when he was under the spell. But he had no wounds or opening in his armors. He had come out of the battle unscathed. But that burn was still there. After the battle was over, he met with his king, and he told him that the Atrogai would not surrender, so they had to end them all. But at least now, the menace was now exterminated. The unbeholden king tells Saraglac that he has plans to make his kingdom into an empire, but it was time. It was time for them to expand. For now, they had to plan how they would move forward, for they would show the other people the feeling of true civilization. And Saraglac responds, "Yes, my king, Vlagurescu." Indeed, that was King Vlagurescu of the Flesheater courts, and this was the story of his noble ghoulish knights. So now tell me, stranger, what makes you think that what you see is reality? What if you are like some of these flesh-eater courts, that you think yourself a noble person, but in reality, you are just a monster? But that is what the mortal realms are all about. We don't know what is real. And this is truly the playground of gods and monsters. And we are just pawns. But thank you for listening to the story. And hopefully you like and subscribe to my channel so I can give you more of this content. Thanks for listening and have a great day.